America's hidden victory, the German prisoners who saw the truth. June 4, 1943. Mexia, Texas. The train had barely rolled to a stop when Unteroffizier Werner Burkhardt pressed his face against the glass and felt something crack open inside him. Not a wound, but a certainty. 3 years of certainty shattering quietly against the Texas night. His hand shook as he reached for the notebook he kept hidden from his own commanders. The words came slowly, as if he still couldn't believe what his eyes were telling him. The Americans can't be telling the truth. No country fighting a war on 2 fronts could have this much wealth. What he was seeing through that window was simple. Ordinary even by American standards. Lights. Lights burning in every farmhouse, every roadside diner, every distant gas station. A sparkling web of electricity blanketing the countryside well past 10 in the evening. Back home in Germany, blackout orders had darkened every city and village since 1940. Even in peacetime, rural electricity had reached fewer than 1 in 5 German farms. Yet here in the America that Nazi radio had spent years describing as weak, corrupt, and on the verge of collapse, here, the lights simply stayed on. In this video, you will watch 371,000 battle-hardened German soldiers go through one of the most remarkable psychological transformations in modern history. Not through force, not through propaganda, but through the simple, overwhelming evidence of what a free society can build. The 1,850 Afrika Korps veterans who stepped off that train in Mexia didn't arrive in livestock cars or open flatbeds. They arrived in comfortable Pullman sleepers, complete with dining service. The entire town of 7,000 had turned out on the platform to watch. Nobody there that evening fully understood what they were witnessing. The opening act of the most effective ideological dismantling in the history of modern warfare. Not fought with bullets, but with factory floors, full dinner plates, and the quiet, unshakable confidence of a country that had nothing to hide. The collapse in the desert. The unraveling had begun 3 weeks earlier on May 13, 1943, in the dust of Tunisia. General Jürgen von Arnim, Rommel's successor in North Africa, surrendered with between 250,000 and 275,000 Axis troops. The numbers fluctuated for days as scattered units trickled in. These were the Wehrmacht's elite desert warriors, the same men who had chased British forces to the gates of Alexandria, earning even Montgomery's reluctant admiration. Now they wore prisoner-of-war tags. Among them was Feldwebel Heinrich Friedrich Radke, Iron Cross First Class, veteran of the France campaign, twice wounded in North Africa. His journal, unearthed years later in the United States National Archives, would become one of the richest accounts ever recorded of what American captivity did to the minds of ordinary German soldiers. The road from defeat to something resembling enlightenment began at the harbor of Oran, Algeria, while Radke and roughly 30,000 comrades waited in tent cities for transport vessels. The machinery of American military logistics began its quiet work. Thousands of men were processed daily with a smoothness that surpassed the Wehrmacht's own capabilities at the height of its triumphs. Dog tags were issued. Photographs taken, medical examinations conducted. Geneva Convention rights recited in flawless German by officers who had been specifically trained for this moment. But it was the food that delivered the first real shock. Obergefreiter Hans Meyer, captured with the 21st Panzer Division, wrote to his mother 8 months later, In the Oran holding pens, they gave us better food than we had seen in 6 months of desert fighting. Real white bread, real coffee, beef in the morning and in the evening. I assumed it was for show. I had no idea this was simply what American soldiers ate every day. The ships that shouldn't have existed. The Liberty ships that carried them across the Atlantic were themselves a kind of argument. The SS Robert E. Peary had been launched after just 4 days, 15 hours and 29 minutes at the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California. A construction timeline so compressed that the Germans initially assumed it was a boast. At peak production, the United States was completing 3 of these vessels every single day. Rather than sailing home empty after supplying Europe, the ships were loaded with up to 30,000 prisoners monthly by the summer of 1943. The 2-week Atlantic crossing became a floating seminar in American industrial capacity. Gefreiter Kurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division kept notes that survived through family correspondence after his release. The crew discarded daily food scraps that exceeded what my entire unit received in a week in the Sahara. They threw away half-eaten steaks, whole loaves of bread, jugs of soured milk, not to taunt us, but because it simply didn't occur to them to do otherwise. They lived as though the supply was infinite. Chatty American sailors filled in the details. Their ship was one of 2,710 Liberty vessels built during the war. Each required 250,000 individual components sourced from 32 states. The engines had been manufactured in 3 separate factories, with final assembly completed in harbors that hadn't existed 2 years before. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Steuben, a Prussian officer from one of Germany's oldest military families, wrote in his memoirs, "As we neared the American coast, I watched the radar antenna spinning on the mast of a cargo freighter. We had believed this technology was exclusive to us and perhaps shared sparingly with the British. Here it was on an ordinary merchant vessel. It was my first real sense that Germany could not win this war. If you're finding this story as remarkable as I do, go ahead and like this video right now. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who love history. And stay with me, because what these men found when they finally arrived on American soil is even more extraordinary." The shore that ended the argument. August 2nd, 1943. Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. The first glimpse of the United States finished what the crossing had begun. The base stretched across 4,300 acres. Mile-long piers reached into the harbor. Electric cranes moved dozens of hulls simultaneously. A single day's processing throughput at Norfolk exceeded Hamburg's weekly maximum. Gefreiter Johann Weber, a machinist from the Ruhr Valley before he was drafted, counted 47 freighters being worked at once. Each crane lifted what would have required 12 men and 8 mules at home. They ran on electricity continuously without the coal smoke that choked our factories. There was no comparison. As the prisoners marched from the docks to the waiting trains, they passed worker parking lots filled with private automobiles. In Germany, personal car ownership had been reserved for party officials and the very wealthy. The Volkswagen, promised to the German public since 1934, had delivered fewer than 1,000 civilian units. Here, ordinary assembly line workers drove themselves to their shifts. The rail cars were the final blow to any remaining illusions about American austerity. No freight wagons. No overcrowded troop transports, reclining seats that folded into sleeping berths. Linen-covered dining tables set with silverware, glass-domed lounge cars offering unobstructed views of the passing landscape. Radke wrote, "We boarded as though we were on holiday, not as prisoners. A sergeant apologized to us about a malfunction with the air conditioning in our car. Air conditioning. In August, we had believed that technology existed only on Hitler's private train. 3 days across America. The 3-day journey from Norfolk to camps in Texas and Oklahoma dismantled National Socialism more thoroughly than Stalingrad had. Through Virginia, the prisoners pressed their faces against the glass and watched small towns they had never heard of. Martinsville, Danville, Greensboro, blazing with light. Storefronts lit with neon signs. Multi-room homes glowing from every window. Night shift mills running at full capacity, parking lots full past midnight. Obergefreiter Meyer, whose father was a Nazi block warden in Hamburg, wrote in a letter discovered in 1987, "We passed dozens of towns in the first evening. Every one of them had more electrical light than all of Hamburg. The guards told us this was normal, that every town had been wired since the 1920s. I told them I didn't believe it. One of them shrugged and said, 'You'll see.' As the train slowed for water and coal stops, the men watched American rail workers refuel a locomotive in 30 minutes, a process that took 2 hours at home. Automated coal loaders, electric water pumps, lubrication systems that required no manual labor. The technical advantage was not dramatic or theatrical. It was everywhere and everything treated as completely unremarkable. Deeper into the journey, the industrial scale of what they were passing through became impossible to process. Tennessee's Alcoa aluminum plant stretched for 3 miles along the river, its electric furnaces consuming 175,000 kilowatts, the equivalent of Munich's entire power grid. Outside Louisville, they slowed past a synthetic rubber complex that had been built from open pasture in 18 months. 4 massive plants, thousands of workers producing 800,000 tons annually. Germany held the original patents for the process and was producing 120,000 tons at peak. Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist who had worked for a major German industrial firm before the war, later described the moment. "I recognized the towers and the cracking units immediately. Each of those plants outperformed our best facility, and there were 4 of them clustered together with more reported elsewhere in the country." The camps. The camps themselves delivered the final cumulative shock. Camp Hearn in Texas had been built in 4 months. It housed between 3,000 and 4,800 men in wooden barracks equipped with electric light, flush toilets, hot showers, and steam heat. The lumber used in construction exceeded the total available to entire German villages. The camp hospital was equipped with X-ray machines, full surgical suites, and medications that had been unavailable in Germany since 1941. Oberstleutnant Dr. Friedrich Bauer, Chief Medical Officer of the 164th Light Division, walked through the facility in silence before writing, "They were administering penicillin, which we had heard of only as a rumor, freely, for minor infections. We had been rationing sulfa drugs for 2 years. They poured their miracle antibiotic without a moment's hesitation." The camp kitchen operated on a scale that defied comprehension. Walk-in refrigerators, industrial mixers, automatic dishwashers, gas ranges capable of preparing 5,000 meals simultaneously. Dairy, eggs, meat, fresh vegetables, and white bread, every day as a matter of routine for men who had been eating desert rations. Feldwebel Otto Krebs, a former Munich hotel manager, wrote, "What they discarded today exceeded what my family had seen in 3 years." There was a rule requiring 10% overproduction to guarantee that every man was fully fed. They threw away fresh loaves of bread. I wept. This story gets even more extraordinary in the next few minutes. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is a great time. We publish new history documentaries every week and you won't want to miss what's coming. Working in the country they couldn't defeat. By September 1943, a labor shortage had opened work programs across the country, sending prisoners into fields and factories under minimal supervision. The ideological consequences proved more devastating than anything the War Department's re-education specialists could have designed. Every day, trucks drove the men through the American heartland without hoods or restrictions. They watched corn and wheat extending to every horizon. They saw triple-shift mills, fully stocked merchant shelves, streams of private automobiles, farmhouses equipped with refrigerators and radios. Gefreiter Herbert Long described operating a single cotton gin machine in Houston that processed what an entire German village would have taken a month to produce by hand. The gin operator was an ordinary farmer, not a party member, not a man of privilege. Yet he had electricity, running water, a truck, an automobile, and mechanical equipment my own factory foreman could only dream of. And his workers, including black workers, carried lunch boxes with more food than a German factory worker received in a week. This was simply normal. Every farm was the same. In Nebraska, prisoners working the sugar beet harvest watched a single mechanical harvester accomplish what would have required 100 workers through an entire season. Farms stretched beyond the visible horizon, yields that German agricultural experts would have classified as impossible. A 16-year-old farm boy explained almost apologetically that his family was waiting on a new tractor because the old one wasn't performing at its best. His father had placed an order for the upgrade. Factory assignments delivered the most concentrated dose of reality. A former food plant supervisor assigned to a Campbell's soup facility in New Jersey watched the operation in something close to silence. It was fully automated. Electric conveyor belts, robotic filling systems, steamers cycling 100 cans at a time. An elderly woman monitored controls that managed what 50 men would have handled at home. And she was listening to the radio while she did it. The mind changes by the winter of 1943. The United States Provost Marshal's Special Projects Division had begun tracking what their internal reports called ideology collapse syndrome. Not a formal diagnosis, but an observable pattern. The steady, voluntary abandonment of National Socialist belief among men who had arrived as convinced, combat-hardened ideological warriors. The mechanism was simple. Major Paul Nordland wrote in a December 1943 memo, "The statistics show that it is not our formal re-education programs producing these results. It is too much for the men to reconcile what they were told with what they can see with their own eyes every single day." The camp newspapers reflected the shift. Publications that had opened with defiance began printing debates about democracy, economics, and post-war reconstruction. Anti-Nazi educational materials found audiences that surprised even the officers distributing them. Lieutenant Hermann Goetz, a veteran of the 10th Panzer Division, wrote to a fellow officer, "Everything we were told about this country being weak, disorganized, and unfit for war has proven to be a fabrication. What we have found here is organized, unified, and operating at a level of power we were never told existed." The December 1943 Christmas distribution crystallized something that rational argument never could have. Over 500,000 packages arrived at American POW camps from churches, civic organizations, and private citizens, sent to men who had been actively trying to kill their sons and husbands. Cigarettes, candy, soap, games, handwritten cards from children. Towns invited prisoners to holiday dinners. Methodist congregations in Herne sang German carols with their captives. Women brought cookies. Boy Scouts delivered cards. Oberleutnant Walter Müller, who had lost a brother in the Hamburg bombings, wrote, "I know who these people are. Their sons and husbands are fighting us at this moment, and yet they show genuine Christian kindness without any performance in it. Only a people who are completely secure in their strength and certain of their victory can afford to treat their enemies this way." The education. By early 1944, more than 40,000 prisoners had voluntarily enrolled in camp educational programs. English language courses, American history, mathematics, natural sciences. University correspondence programs offered through Chicago and Stanford brought democracy, economics, and constitutional law into the barracks. Books were consumed faster than they could be supplied. German prisoners who had grown up in a system that controlled every printed word found themselves with access to multiple newspapers, uncensored, representing opposing political viewpoints. A physicist who had worked at a major German research institute attended a lecture at Camp Shelby given by a professor who had fled Europe. He shared freely everything he knew without reservation with prisoners of his adopted country's enemy. He spoke of science as the common property of all humanity. The generosity was something the Nazi framework had made genuinely unthinkable. The Hollywood films shown in the camp theaters operated as a different kind of argument. Lieutenant Josef Kramer described watching a major American film that depicted an ordinary family struggling through economic hardship and moral failure. They hid nothing. They showed their own problems, their own failures, their own internal conflicts, openly to anyone who wanted to watch. In Germany, such a film would never have been permitted. Here they considered it patriotic. A country that can look honestly at itself is not afraid of what it will find. We're getting to the most powerful part of this story. What happened when these men finally went home? Leave a comment below. Do you think witnessing American industrial power genuinely changed these men? Or were there other factors at work? I read every comment. D-Day and the final accounting on June 6, 1944, news of the Normandy landings reached the camps. The operational scale, 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, 150,000 men in the first wave, was beyond anything the prisoners had been told the Allies were capable of organizing. Within days, reels arrived at Camp Shelby showing the beach supply operation. 15,000 tons of material delivered daily across an open coastline under fire. Friedrich von Tauben, a career Wehrmacht officer, described the moment with characteristic precision. We understood then that the war was over, not because of what happened on the beach, but because of what was behind the beach. We had been told we were fighting an industrial weakling driven by cowardice and internal chaos. We had spent a year living inside the evidence that this was completely false. In April 1945, the first footage of the Nazi concentration camps reached the prisoners. For many, it was not a surprise so much as a confirmation of what the slow accumulation of evidence had been pointing toward. The great cause they had been fighting for had been built on criminality from its foundation. Schmidt wrote in his journal, "We came believing we were warriors of a great civilization, sent to hold back the inferior and the weak. We leave knowing we were instruments of barbarism. The civilization we came to destroy was the one we were watching out the window of that train. Going home." The repatriations of 1945 and 1946 sent 371,000 men back to a Germany that no longer existed. They returned to rubble and division and destitution. But many of them carried something the rubble couldn't erase, a clear first-hand understanding of how a democratic industrial society functions at the height of its power. The Marshall Plan, announced before most of them had even unpacked, confirmed what they had come to believe. America was not going to punish Germany. It was going to rebuild it. Von Tobin wrote, "We were sent home with vocational training, agricultural knowledge, and something rarer than either, the experience of having been treated as human beings by a country that had every reason to do otherwise. We left as defeated soldiers. We arrived as citizens of a future that hadn't been built yet. The men who came back shaped the Germany that rose from those ashes." Among the former prisoners who went on to hold significant positions in post-war German and European public life were diplomats, agricultural leaders, academics, and officials at the highest levels of European institutions. The economic miracle of the 1950s was built by men who had seen from the inside what democratic capitalism looked like at full capacity, and who came home determined to build something worth living in. The reunion. In 1985, more than 500 former prisoners returned to Texas with their families for a 40th anniversary reunion. Many brought their children and grandchildren to the towns where their understanding of the world had been permanently remade. Hans Wehr, who had arrived as a Wehrmacht soldier and gone on to practice medicine in the United States, spoke at the event. "I grew up in the Reich believing that what I had was normal. Then I arrived here and discovered running water, central heating, abundant food, and something even harder to name. Dignity as a daily expectation rather than a reward for compliance. It changed everything that came after." Iowa farmer Kurt Meyer, who had worked American fields under minimal guard in the summer of 1944, said, "They didn't treat us as enemies. They treated us as young men who were far from home. They shared their meals with us, their knowledge, sometimes their homes. These were people whose sons were fighting us. I have never forgotten that." The keynote address was given by former Oberleutnant Hermann Goetz, then 78 years old. "I came to America as a believer in everything the Nazi state had taught me about this country and its people. I left as a man who had seen the truth with his own eyes. Not the strength of conquest, but the strength of production. Not the power of hatred, but the power of diversity, organized and purposeful. Not the security of tyranny, but the confidence of freedom. The kind of confidence that allows you to treat your enemy with dignity because you no longer need to fear him. I returned to Germany with a mission, to help build a society worth living in." The Germany that rose from the ashes was built in part on what men like me learned in American camps. We came as conquerors. We left as students, to the country that was once our enemy and is now our friend. Thank you for showing us the way." The room rose, former enemies, now old men, standing together in a Texas banquet hall. The transformation that had seemed impossible on a train platform in 1943 finally, completely, revealed. What the numbers tell us. The scale of what America achieved with its prisoner of war program remains without historical parallel. At its peak, the system housed more than 425,000 Axis prisoners across 500 camps in 45 states. The equivalent of a mid-sized American city, administered, fed, and educated under the rules of the Geneva Convention without a single major violation recorded. Of 371,000 German prisoners held in the United States, just 2,222 ever attempted escape, a rate of 0.6%. Not a single permanent escape was ever confirmed. Nearly all were recovered within 24 hours, often voluntarily returning when they realized the surrounding countryside offered nothing more compelling than the camp did. There were no confirmed cases of civilian harm. Surveys conducted after repatriation found that 95% of former prisoners rated their treatment as good or excellent. 74% reported that captivity had improved their view of the world. 61% expressed genuine interest in democratic governance. Fewer than 10% maintained strong National Socialist beliefs at the time of their release in 1945. Approximately 5,000 former prisoners eventually immigrated to the United States. More than 12,000 maintained correspondence with American families for an average of 31 years after returning home. The greatest victory America won in the Second World War was not measured in territory captured or armies destroyed. It was measured in the quiet, permanent transformation of the men who had come to defeat it. Men who arrived carrying a worldview built on lies about weakness and corruption and inferiority, and who left carrying something far more durable, the memory of what they had actually seen. A full plate, an electric light, a toilet that worked, a guard who apologized about the air conditioning. The arsenal of democracy did not win the war only by building more than its enemies. It won finally and completely by being exactly what it claimed to be, and letting 371,000 witnesses go home to tell the story.